Hi there, Andrey is here, and this time we're going to discuss the Muzio Gambit, one of the sharpest lines in King's Gambit accepted. So it goes like e4, e5, f4. Now black accepts the gambit and takes the pawn on f4. White continues with the knight to f3 move, the main line, and black decides to play g5. So in this situation, white can play h4, which we have discussed in the previous video. But there is also another option which is pretty sharp. So white develops the bishop on c4, already exerting some pressure on f7. And if black plays g4, being ready to protect f7 with the knight from h6 if the knight goes to e5, or maybe intending even to give this check on h4 when the knight moves. White reacts in a very interesting way. So simply ignores the threat to the knight f3 and makes castling. So what is this? Well, actually black can take the knight and probably has to take the knight at this point, because otherwise it's not clear why black made all these pawn moves, being completely underdeveloped. So g takes f3. There is no immediate punishment for it, obviously. So queen simply takes on f3, continuing the attack along the f-file. And now we have the first critical position. So black may try different things here. It's not really clear if this or that move is right or wrong. This position should be analyzed deeply to get the first impression, in fact. But we can already see the problem. So it's not so simple for black to complete the development of the kingside. White already has an amazing concentration of pieces against f7. So white's task is basically just to take on f4 at some point, not necessarily with the queen. Sometimes white does this with the bishop. And there will be already a huge problem with f7 and hence with the king. So let's try to imagine what can happen if black makes the most natural move. What can be more natural than the tempo development of the minor piece here? So bishop goes to c5 with check. King simply goes to h1. And now, in order to prevent immediate capture on f4, black tries something like queen to h4. It will be very nice to exchange queens in case of capture on f4. But white doesn't want to do that, obviously, and continues with a very aggressive d4 move here. So tempo move, and after bishop captures on d4, white actually continues with the bishop takes f4, keeping the queen on the board and already having a threat against f7. For example, if black gets greedy here and moves the bishop to b2, then there is an immediate win for white after bishop to g5. Attacking the queen, at the same time attacking the f7, and it's basically over, because if queen takes, then after queen takes f7, king d8 and queen to f8, it's just a checkmate. So after bishop captures on f4, black has to be extremely careful, because there is a direct threat of a checkmate. So instead of taking that pawn, black may try knight to h6. Also looks crazy because at first glance, white may take here. But in that case, queen captures, and it appears that the king is quite safe here because black controls most critical squares. For example, after queen takes f7, king goes to d8, and there is no immediate checkmate. This bishop is actually a very important defender of most critical squares, as well as both heavy pieces are coordinated to cover the back rank. So in the future, black will play something like bishop e5, starting the counterattack against h2 and complete the development of the queen side. So black is going to be fine here. It's impossible to take the knight hence, and white should try something different. So in this position, white continues with the development. It's also a very natural move. Simply knight to c3, preparing either knight d5 or knight b5, attacking c7, which is also quite vulnerable after black moved the queen from d8 to h4. Here, again, black has different options, but I just wanted to stick to most natural moves to show you the ideas and to make you feel the spirit of this gambit. Let's say knight goes to c6. White may continue with the knight to d5, attacking c7 already. For example, black castles, because why not, right? So the king is much safer now. In case of real danger on the g-file, the king is ready to go to the corner. But here white may surprise black with an interesting resource. Out of the blue, white just moves the queen to h3, offering the exchange of queens. appears that after king moved to g8, knight no longer has so many squares to go away in case of attack. And white attacks the knight already 2 times. So queen takes h3, g takes h3, pawn h3 grabs this g4 square, so knight is under pressure, and it's hard to protect it. There are only 2 options, bishop to g7 and king to g7. Let's start with the king to g7. Looks okay, bishop controls the g1 square, so white cannot play rook to g1 directly. The problem though is that this bishop doesn't have so many squares in this diagonal, and white may just harass it. So c3, and the bishop is forced somewhere away from the diagonal, or in case it stays on this diagonal, after bishop to c5, white may continue with the b4 move, and after bishop to b6, may capture it, and after a takes b6, rook finally gets to g1 with check, and after the king goes away, of course, knight drops. White regains the sacrificed minor piece and has an amazing attack with pair of bishops and pair of rooks. Black is still not developed completely here. So after c3, black may try something like bishop to e5 instead. Let's have a look at that option. This means bishop no longer controls g1 square, and white may play rook to g1 immediately. So after this check, black doesn't have so many options. For example, if king goes to the corner of the board, knight simply drops. So black may try knight to g4, but it only delays the inevitable scenario with the bishop on h6, attacking the rook, and then g7 square. So rook takes g4 here. King goes to the corner, it is forced. Then bishop goes to h6, attacking the rook. Now it's unclear where to go. For example, if rook goes to g8, let's start with this move. Rook captures on g8, king captures on g8, then the rook from the other side may join the attack, but instead of doing it, white first captures the pawn on c7, deflecting the bishop from the square g7. For example, bishop takes c7, and now rook may go to g1, and after king to h8, simply bishop captures f7. Super powerful. There are 2 checkmates on g8 with the rook or on g7 with the bishop, and black simply doesn't have the defense against both. White is simply winning here. So let's get back a bit and see if black can survive it after moving the rook away to e8 square. So in this position, rook to e8, not allowing white to take the rook and then connect another one, and bishop remains here. So there are different options possible for white. One of the most straightforward ones is just to play rook a to g1. Now simply attacking g7 square. White is important because after d6, which looks natural, bishop goes to g7. After bishop takes on g7, white recaptures with the rook. So rook comes to g7, not really to attack f7, but to create an amazing threat against h7. So white is going to play knight f6 next move, and it's really hard to find a defense against it. So most likely white is simply winning in this case. Let's get back a bit and try to understand if the other defense of the knight on h6 could help black to survive it. So in this position, black may try another option to protect the knight h6 with the bishop. Let's have a look at that one. Bishop goes to g7. White obviously continues with the rook to g1. What can be more natural? Just attacking the knight again. And after king to h8, it is possible to sacrifice even more material. So rook captures on g7 now, eliminating the only real defender of dark squares in black's camp. King captures on g7, white continues with the natural rook to g1 check, forcing the king to h8. And look at this position. White is not even in a rush to take the knight on h6, so white starts with the knight takes c7. At the moment, if we count the pieces, because I think it's time to do this, white is simply the rook down, but black's pieces are so disorientated here, and white's pieces are so coordinated that black has no satisfactory way to diffuse the pressure. For instance, if black tries just to move the rook from a8 to b8, bishop may capture on h6, where after rook goes to g8 to prevent bishop to g7, and white may even capture an f7 here, just attacking the rook, forcing the exchange of rooks, and even with this low material on the board, white is much better because the king is completely limited. White's idea is just to checkmate it with the bishop check on this diagonal a1, h8. And it's not so hard to implement because black is so constrained, so underdeveloped. Rook doesn't play any role in the game so far, as well as the bishop. So the only real fighter is the knight here, but it's not enough. For example, if knight goes to e5, which looks natural, bishop simply steps back to d5. And here, black has to do something against knight e8 followed by bishop g7, but there is no real defense. For instance, d6 may be played, but then knight goes to e8 anyway, and now black has to sacrifice a lot of material to prevent the worst, the checkmate. For example, bishop goes to e6, covering the diagonal and preparing king to g8 move. Now bishop g7 first, king goes to g8, bishop captures on e6, forcing the knight to f7 move. It's the only one which is possible here. And then white simply captures on d6 using the fact that the knight f7 is pinned. Now it's hanging. There is no even rook f8 move to cover it because bishop controls that square, so king captures on g7, where after white takes on f7 with the bishop, and white has a decisive material advantage, so 2 minor pieces against the rook, a couple of extra pawns, and the knight can be protected with the e5 in case it is attacked. So, all these lines are not necessarily very accurate, all these lines are not necessarily forced. I was giving you just a general sensation of the spirit of this gambit. Now let's have a look at the critical one. So in this situation, black may protect f4 immediately with the move queen to f6. It is also an additional defense on the f7, which looks like the most vulnerable square in black's camp. After that, what's interesting, white may consider a pretty simple d3 move, so which is sort of positional way of playing it. Even in such a crazy situation, at some point the attacking side may switch to playing positional chess. So d3 prepares the capture on f4 with the bishop. That's the point here. White is not in a rush because it's still not entirely clear how black is going to complete the development. So after d3, black plays knight to c6, bishop captures on f4. Black may play something like d6 here, knight goes to c3, creating a threat of knight e5 or maybe knight to b5. And after something like queen g7, knight to d5, and king to d8, we can see that white is having just a very, very small material compensation, actually only one pawn. But the concentration of white's pieces here in the center and the way they are interacting is really impressive. While black is doing nothing at the moment. So the queen is sort of developed, the king has no longer a chance to castle in this game. So white definitely has very annoying pressure, and in a practical situation, it will be really hard for black to survive it. At least black may want to play a lot of accurate moves in a row, which is, well, not always that simple, all right? So it's one of the possibilities, but true lovers of this gambit usually plays in a much more aggressive way against queen to f6. So one of the topical continuations here is e4, e5 push. So exactly in this position, white just plays e5. And after queen captures on e5, because what else, actually? There is no rook e1, fortunately, but there is another interesting possibility now. So white continues with a surprising sacrifice of the second piece. So bishop captures on f7. It's amazing. I mean, after king takes f7, there is no immediate checkmate whatsoever. There is no decisive continuation for white. To be completely honest, this position is most likely just better for black, but from a practical point of view, it's so hard to defend it unless you have a very deep knowledge of this position. But to get the really deep knowledge in this position, you have to analyze like each and every continuation, otherwise it's impossible. By the way, it was not forced to take the bishop on f7. It was also possible just to go away with the king to d8. Well, in that case, white's compensation would be bigger than here. So, what's going on next? After king takes f7, obviously white doesn't want to take on f4 exchanging queens, so instead white plays d4, another sacrifice. But very logical, white wants to take on f4 with the bishop. Queen captures on d4 with check. White doesn't want to spend additional time for moving the king to h1, instead playing bishop to e3, using the fact that f4 is pinned. So if queen captures on e3 accidentally, then white just takes the queen and white is a queen up. So it's not possible, which means black has to choose the right square for a queen. And again, there is no a single solution. So different moves are possible. The most critical part here is that how you play after that and how deep your knowledge is. For example, after queen to g7 here, white may capture on f4 with the bishop. So two minor pieces down, but still attacking the king. After knight to f6, for example, bishop goes to e5. Looks impressive, but black has sufficient resources here, for example, bishop to e7. And after knight to c3, the move d6 is required. So only this move gives black chances to actually hold it and maybe even win it after all. So only this move challenging the bishop, maybe forcing the exchange on f6 with further complicated play. But if black makes another move, which looks also very natural, just rook f8, preparing king to g8, get into a safe place, white is winning. So knight goes to d5, attacking everything. After king goes to g8, white plays queen to b3, now creating a bunch of threats like knight c7, knight e7, knight f6, literally everything that you can imagine is threatened. King goes to h8. Now white eliminates the defender of dark squares, knight e7, queen e7, and no surprises that with so immobilized pieces, black is losing because white is already having decisive continuation. It is queen to c3, exerting further pressure on this long diagonal. So black is really in trouble here. There is no good way to protect the knight anyway. So it's possible, for example, to try knight to c6, but then after bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, and rook takes f6, we may notice that white is no longer worse materially. So white has the rook against two minor pieces, but what's important here, these minor pieces are not that efficient. So the knight is already developed, but it's not doing anything specific. The bishop is still there on the initial position, so it's really hard for black to survive it. For example, knight goes to e5, at least trying to cover the long diagonal. Another rook joins the fight after rook a to f1. Black may protect the knight with the d6 here, but then rook goes to f7, using the fact that knight on e5 is pinned, which means black is losing c7. For example, after queen e6, rook f8 check, king goes to g7. It's possible just to take c7 with the queen, and it's over, basically. So definitely black may want to make a couple of extra moves here, but it's clear that with so inefficient bishop and the rook, it's just impossible to play against two coordinated rooks and the queen having so bad king here. Let's get back to queen f6 possibility after white's bishop e3 move. So after bishop to e3, queen goes to f6, still sort of covering the f-file. Bishop captures on f4 anyway, and now there are different threats, including some checks along the a2 g8 diagonal, for example, like this at some point. There are also other options like queen d5 or queen h5, followed by the discovered attack, moving the bishop somewhere. So here, black has to be really careful. One of the options that give black very distant position is knight to e7. Again, it may not look very natural, but that's what we have here if we want to survive it. For example, if black chooses something like king to e8, which is also not really pleasant, because in this case, the king moves back to the initial position where it is not necessarily that safe. It's definitely safer than on the f-file, but it doesn't look that impressive anyway. So to king e8, it's possible to continue with the knight to c3. Now white is ready to jump with the knight to d5 to connect rooks to the attack and so on. And the only option here is probably to try something like knight to e7 again, covering the d5 square, and after knight to b5, which is another option after knight to c3, to play something like d6, actually sacrificing some part of the material. So after knight takes c7, king goes to d8, and after knight takes a8, Alright, white has the rook against two minor pieces again. Most likely white is not risking anymore, but black is also having some chances here because these pieces now have some squares to be developed and to be coordinated the right way. And this knight on a8 is not necessarily that great. But what if black decides to do something else? Let's get back a bit and let's have a look at what happens if instead of playing knight to e7, black decides not to control d5 at all and plays knight to c6. It appears that weakening of the d5 square is critical, so knight jumps to d5 in this situation. After queen goes away, white may take on c7, but another powerful option is just to continue the attack with the rook to e1 check. And now if black plays something like bishop to e7, there is an amazing shot. It happened in one of the games of Alexei Shirov. He was playing with white, obviously, so it is bishop to d6. Very strong move. Not only attacking the bishop on e7, but creating an amazing threat of queen f8 checkmate using the fact that bishop on e7 is pinned. So black has no satisfactory defense, for example, after king to d8, going away from the e-file. White has very good looking checkmate. It is queen to f8, sacrificing the queen, but controlling the e-file now, followed by bishop takes c7, checkmate. So after bishop takes f4, knight e7 looks like the most decent option. Let's have a look at that. It's still pretty complicated, but that is what black should do, I guess. So in this position, black puts the knight on e7, trying to cover the king in various ways, depending on how white is going to attack. The main idea being to put the knight on f5 at some point, just to close the f-file. So here white may continue with the knight to c3. Again, this position requires additional analysis, obviously, but one of the possibilities that the engine suggests here is queen to c6, trying to exchange queens. White may continue in different ways, but pay attention that even if there is a discovered attack with the bishop, it's not necessarily that dangerous, because we managed to save the most important piece, it is queen, and if we lose some sort of a rook, it's not a big deal because we already have two extra minor pieces. So to queen to c6, knight may go to e4, another interesting direction of attack, just bring the knight to g5. Black should start the development here. It's time, it's the move number 13, so d5, preparing the development of the bishop, but mainly controlling f5 square, so being ready to occupy it. For example, after bishop to e5 check, knight may jump to f5, covering the king at the moment. White may continue with the knight to g3, just attacking this knight. Black cannot really save it, so the best way to react is actually bishop c5 with check, at least developing the bishop for now. King goes to h1, and here black has a chance to go away with the rook from the vulnerable position, and it appears that black's position is, well, not so bad. So after rook to f8, for example, black prepares king to g8 move, and at the moment black's pieces are sort of coordinated finally. So it still requires a lot of work to develop these guys on the queen side, but, well, at least the worst is prevented. For example, after knight takes f5, bishop captures on f5, queen captures on f5, all this looks pretty natural. The king goes to g8. So now, obviously, the rook is protected, so the normal continuation of the attack is to give this check on g5. And now the queen comes. So queen to g6, covering the king, and after rook takes f8, bishop takes f8, white may continue with an interesting queen to d8 move. Pinning everything on the back rank, preparing rook to f1 move, also attacking the pawn on d5. So it looks like the best way for black here, again, is to forget about the material and to play knight to c6. After that, queen captures the rook. White loses the bishop on e5. And now we have an interesting material balance. So black has two minor pieces. White is going to have the rook and the pawn after something like rook to f1, attacking the bishop, forcing something like queen to d6 to protect it, and then capturing the pawn on b7. But black is not forced to lose one more, I mean the a7 pawn. So it's possible to protect it with, say, a6 or maybe a5. And this should be a balanced position finally. So it no longer looks so crazy, but you know. To get this position, of course, you have to learn a ton. So as a general conclusion, I would say that this is an extremely dangerous line, especially if you play it as black. So it may also be dangerous if you play it as white against a well-prepared opponent. So to play this line, either with white or black, you need an amazing knowledge. You should be also a very good tactical player, because it is all about tactical tricks and the accurate calculation of different lines. But I would suggest you to try that one, because, well, while playing it, it doesn't matter if you win or lose, you will learn a lot about the attack and defense. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this one useful. In the next video, we're going to discuss the classical variation of the King's Gambit. See you there.